So today, welcome to story time again. Today we're going to read a book called Song of Solomon, which is a fantastic book. Let me share the screen for you here. I think it's right here. Present. Okay. Song of Solomon, written by Toni Morrison. There's another Toni Morrison book on the list called The Bluest Eye. If you don't know much about Toni Morrison, she was born and raised in the Midwest, which is exciting. And this book, Song of Solomon, takes place partly in Michigan. This book, Song of Solomon, is her third novel. She's best known for her book called Beloved, which was turned into a movie by Oprah. She won the Pulitzer Prize for that. This book, President Obama said was one of his favorites, if not his favorite, I forget. And some other information about Toni Morrison: she was the first African-American woman to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, meaning she was the best writer in the world in 1993. And deservingly so. This is a great book, and she's a great writer, and hopefully you get a chance to read some of her stuff. She's still alive, and so maybe she's working on some more work. That would be fantastic. But this book begins with Robert Smith on the top of Mercy Hospital. He's an insurance agent, and that might be important in some way. Insurance agent who's going to fly. He's on top of the hospital because he thinks he can fly, or maybe he can't fly. I forget what happened. I was just talking about this book with a friend of mine who's also read it, and I think he said he splattered on the ground, but that's beyond the point. This is where the excitement of the book opens up, with this guy thinking he's going to fly. Now, the hospital is on Main Street of this town, or what a lot of people call Not Doctor Street, because back in the day, the only black doctor who lived in the town lived on this street, and so the people in the town who maybe couldn't read or write called it Doctor Street. And so when they would write letters and things to people on Doctor Street, they would write like 34 Doctor Street, and the post office would get so upset by this that they would send the mail back with a little note that it's not Doctor Street. So then the name then becomes Not Doctor Street rather than Main Street. Anyways, Ruth Foster Dead is in the hospital, pregnant. And we'll talk about the Dead family. One of the Dead family who was there is a woman named Pilot Dead. Pilot is Ruth's sister-in-law. Pilot's married to Macon Dead II. Somebody else who's in the scene is a little boy named Guitar Baines. We'll talk a lot about Guitar later on. Guitar is very, very smart. He's correcting some of the nurses who are kind of telling people what to do, all the chaos with Robert Smith up at there who's trying to fly, and then the birth going on here in the hospital. Regardless, the boy who's born is Macon Dead III, and he is going to become the main character of the book. His nickname is Milkman, and we'll refer to him as Milkman for the rest of the book and your analysis as well. He has that name because he breastfed until the age of 4. So I'm not sure what this tells you about him, or about his relationship and connection with his mother, or maybe his mother's connection to him. But that's how he gets his nickname. And he discovers that early on that only planes and birds can fly. And he's really, really disappointed by this. This is something that he wants to do. And there's going to be something about the supernatural, about things like human beings flying, like we saw with Robert Smith in the first chapter, early on in the book. You can pick or choose whether or not you believe these supernatural things are occurring, but it seems to be throughout the course of the book, there are some characters, most of the characters even, seem to believe that there are these supernatural things occurring. Milkman's father is Macon Dead II, or Macon Jr. He's not a very nice man. He's wealthy. He's middle class. I shouldn't say wealthy, but he's middle class, very comfortable. And he has that because he's a landlord. He rents out homes to people, but he's a very mean landlord. There's one case where one of his tenants commits suicide, I think, and he shows up to get the rent from the family, even though the father had died. Pilot is Macon's sister. Macon is ashamed of Pilot because of how Pilot looks. She's drab. She looks poor. Her house has like no electricity and running water. She lives very simply, and she lives there with her daughters Reba and Hagar. By the way, Pilot has no navel, and so there's some symbolism in there as well. So as we see, Milkman's connected to his mother till the age of 4. Pilot has no navel, which is that connection, the physical connection to the mother. So I'll let you think about that. By the way, you can see that these are all biblical names, and for those of you who are more knowledgeable about your Bible, maybe these mean something to you, but they're beyond the purview of this discussion of the book. Chapter 2 starts out with a drive the family takes to what's called Honore Beach. I don't know if you know this, but especially around the Great Lakes, there were these African-American resort towns. I forget the one that was on the West Coast there in Michigan, Lake Michigan. I think they're trying to bring that back. But there's these places. I think this is in Ohio where the book is right now. Or maybe it's Michigan, I don't know. But imagine this huge green Packard is the car that they have, and it's a beautiful car. It's huge. The whole family piles in. The whole Dead family piles in. And it's funny, the neighborhood and the community talks about it as the hearse, because here's the Dead family in this very nice car driving down the road. As they're driving, Milkman has to use the restroom, and they don't want to stop, but he throws a tantrum, so they stop, and he goes out, he's doing his business, and one of his cousins, Lena, comes up from behind and kind of startles him, and Milkman turns around before he's finished his business and does his business all over his cousin. And so this is like kind of a symbolism of where Milkman's vision is always. It's always like on the future, and he has trouble identifying and seeing things that have occurred before or behind him. And so the past is something he has trouble with, which is kind of the point of the whole book. Let's see. Milkman skips over to his aunt's house, Pilot's house, and kind of hides out because Macon Jr. doesn't want him to do this. But he goes over there and he listens to stories about Pilot, explains stories about where they came from, and they come from Montour County, Pennsylvania, and she talks a little bit about their father's ghost, and we'll get to that later on. Milkman sees this green sack hanging from the ceiling of Pilot's living room. And that's interesting that not many people have green sacks hanging from ceilings, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Hagar and Milkman meet, and they fall in love. And Milkman says he fell in love with Hagar even before he saw her face. But they're cousins, and they're in love, and that's going to prove to be a little bit troubling a little bit later. Reba, who is Hagar's sister, Pilot's daughter, is just very lucky. She seems to win things. She won a diamond ring from Sears, and she's going to win some other things later on. So Milkman goes home and says, listen, I went over to your sister's house, Pilot's house, and I heard about Montour County, and he's expecting his dad to be mad at him, but and initially he is, but when he begins to reminisce about Pennsylvania and Montour County and the place that they used to live when they were kids called, what's it called? Lincoln's Heaven. Lincoln's Heaven was like the plantation that they grew up on, the farm that they grew up But so there's some like happiness in Macon Jr.'s life when he was growing up. But then he quickly gets back to being a little bit angry, and he says, "Milkman, you can never go back to Pilot's house." And he calls her a snake. And again, when we think about the biblical phrase of what that might mean, where the snake in the Garden of Eden represented loss of innocence and shame and guilt and sin and all that kind of stuff. But there is a connection made between Macon Jr. and Milkman at this time, and Macon Jr. promises to tell or teach the real estate business to Milkman. So things move along here in chapter 4, and I think chapter 4 covers age 17 to age 31 for Milkman. So it's a quickly moving book here. Milkman and Hagar have their ups and downs in their relationship. Milkman begins to treat her like a third beer, he says. He partakes of her because it's there. So Milkman just, kind of takes advantage of Hagar. He looks for a wife in other places. But finally, when he's 31, he writes Hagar a letter that says, we shouldn't be doing this anymore. Milkman and Guitar grow up to be friends, best friends, but they seem to be growing apart. Milkman really hasn't found his path in life, and Guitar has. Guitar is a very serious, very smart person. And he tells Milkman, "You're just living a frivolous life. You need to stop doing this." Milkman tells of a dream at this point where his mom is planting flower bulbs in the backyard. You know what I mean? And so she puts them in the ground, and they grow instantly, and they begin to choke her. And he says it's a dream in the book, but he also says he knows it really happened. And so again, there's a supernatural thing about life in this place. We're not really sure what's true and what's not true. Milkman has a conversation with one of the janitors at the school or someplace in town, and the janitor tells Milkman that Guitar's doing bad things, that he murdered a white boy. By the way, all the characters and the deads and all that are African Americans. So we'll get back to what Guitar's doing later on. Hagar is obsessed with Milkman. Even though Milkman's trying to break this off, she is obsessed with him. And so Milkman tries to avoid her by hanging out with Guitar more and more. Guitar is becoming more paranoid. His house, he's got like triple locks on. And he lectures Milkman all the time about the oppression of African Americans in the United States. He seems to want to tell Milkman something, but he doesn't. In fact, he has to leave quickly to go to a meeting that he can't tell Milkman what the meeting's about. And so while Milkman is alone, he recalls having a dream, or he recalls one night that he followed his mom to the cemetery, and his mom visited the grave of Dr. Foster. I don't think I want to go there, but no, I'll go there. Macon Jr., Milkman's father, thought this relationship that Ruth Dead, who is Macon Jr.'s wife, who is Milkman's mother from the first slide here, Macon Jr. thought his wife had a weird relationship with Dr. Foster. When Dr. Foster died, Ruth cut off the sex life that he had with her husband, Macon Jr. But then when they wanted to have sex again, Ruth gave Macon Jr. an aphrodisiac, a drug that would excite things up a little bit, and they said they had sex for 4 days, and the result of that was Milkman. And when Ruth was pregnant with Milkman, Macon Jr. decided that he wanted to have an abortion and didn't want Milkman. So there's all that complication there as well. Milkman, anyways, is hiding out at Guitar's place, and he hears Hagar's footsteps, and Hagar Hagar breaks in carrying a butcher knife and is going to try to kill Milkman. And instead of fighting back, Milkman just kind of closes his eyes, and he's going to accept whatever is going to happen. In fact, he wishes that Hagar's dead. But Hagar gets the knife and does stab Milkman, but it just kind of glances the collarbone, causes no damage. So don't know what that means, but like I said, Milkman wasn't going to fight back. Milkman's mother, Ruth, finds out about the murder attempt and goes to visit Pilate, who is Hagar's mother, and is like, we need to do something about this. And Ruth is like, if you don't do something, Pilate, I'm going to have to do something to Hagar. Hagar's right there as well. And they both Ruth and Hagar speak of their love for Milkman, which is a little interesting as well. Both the mother and the cousin and girlfriend are explaining their love for Milkman. And then Pilate steps in, and Pilate's like, no woman should feel so much connection or owe so much to a man. And that kind of settles things down, and everyone kind of talks about things. And things kind of calm down, and Ruth and Pilate become friends. And we'll just skip through that. So finally, Milkman confronts Guitar and says, like, what are you doing, man? All these secret meetings, and I hear you're doing bad things and all that. And so finally, Guitar breaks down, and he tells him what's going on. Guitar belongs to a secret society called the 7 Days. The 7 Days are 7 black men. Each of these African-American men are assigned a different day of the week. And so when an innocent African-American is killed by a white person in this community, then whoever is assigned that day of the week must then kill white people the same way that the African-Americans were killed. So this is the secret thing that Guitar's been doing. So Milkman's response is like, look, there's many white people that have sacrificed for civil rights. There are plenty of white people who believe in equality and all that. And he says, Guitar, you got to stop seeing white people. You have to stop essentializing all white people the same. There are some good whites and there's some good or bad whites. And so he's like, you're going crazy, Guitar. You shouldn't be a murderer. And Guitar won't hear anything of it. And he's like, you know what? You're turning your back on African Americans everywhere. And Milkman says, well, you know what? You might start liking to kill so much as a solving your problem. You might start killing African Americans as well. You might even kill me one day, Milkman says to Guitar. Milkman's been doing, the normal business of Macon Jr., and he tells Macon Jr. that, look, I'm going to take a year off and travel and explore and try to understand what's going on in the world and myself. And during that conversation, he let slip that he saw this green sack in Pilate's house years ago. And when Macon Jr. hears about the green sack, his eyes light up, and he's like, oh boy, do I have a story for you. So the story goes like this. Macon the First, who is Macon Jr.'s father, Milkman's grandfather, was murdered back in Lincoln's Haven, Montour County, Pennsylvania. And Macon Jr. and Pilate, who were brother and sister, hid in the manor house of Lincoln's Haven, where Cirque was the maid of the place, and she kind of took care of them for 2 weeks. But after 2 weeks, they leave and they go out. Macon Jr. and Pilate are going out on their own, and they see on a stump a ghost. And it looks like maybe the ghost of their father. And they chase it down, and the ghost goes into this cave. And they follow the ghost into the cave, but they can't find it. And it's getting dark, so they go to sleep. In the morning, they wake up, and there's an old white man who is sleeping in the cave with them. and it freaks Macon Jr. out, and he goes crazy and kills the white man. And they open it, they take the covers off him, and they find underneath this green tarp that's on top of the white man these gold nuggets. And then their father's ghost appears again and darts around the cave and leaves. Macon Jr. is like, we should follow him, but I really want the treasure. Pilate says, no, let's leave the treasure. And they fight. Macon Jr. runs away, and 3 days later, he comes back to the cave. And again, think about 3 days in the biblical sense. I believe Jesus was in the tomb for 3 days right before he was resurrected. So 3 days pass. Macon Jr. comes back to the cave, hopefully to make amends with Pilate. But Pilate's gone. The dead man is still there, but the gold is gone and the green tarp is gone. And so you can imagine what Macon Jr. thinks is in the green sack in Pilate's house. Meanwhile, there's been a church bombing where 4 little African-American girls are killed. And so in response to that, suddenly Guitar is the one who's assigned to now bomb a white church and kill 4 little white girls. He doesn't have enough money to buy the explosives, and so he's trying to find a way to do this. And this is when Milkman tells Guitar about, hey, what about this gold in my aunt's house? We can go get that. And so they zip over there, and they take the sack, and they're stealing the sack. And let's see. They're going to steal the sack. Let's just say that. We can skip to 1 Corinthians. Oh, so Macon and Milkman are having this big argument because Milkman got arrested. They said they stole the green bundle, they put it in the back of the car, and they got pulled over by the police. Now, this incident where he gets pulled over, it's really the first time that Milkman realizes that he got pulled over because of the color of his skin. And he hasn't really realized the impact of racism on his life and in the community in which he lives and his condition. But this is the first time. But anyways, they search the car, and guess what? There's no gold in the bundle, but rather there's some rocks and a human skeleton. They confront Pilate, like, whose bones are these? And Pilate says they're my dead husband, Mr. Solomon. And we'll get to Solomon a little bit later on. Everyone gets released. The cops somehow believe Pilate, maybe because he's got some supernatural powers. But Macon Jr. confronts Pilate and says, what happened to that gold so many years ago? And Pilate says, I left it in the cave. And so Macon Jr. believes that it's still in the cave. Okay. Milkman says he tells Guitar he's going to go to Pennsylvania to look for the gold in the cave, and if he finds any gold, he'll give half of it to Guitar. And so Milkman hops on a plane and flies to Pittsburgh, and this is the first time Milkman has flown. And if you remember the first time, he's back in the early part of the book, he's always wanted to fly, and now he's finally doing it. And suddenly we start to see the transition of Milkman away from this almost like paralyzed character in this community of not really understanding where he's from and what he's supposed to do, but just kind of stuck in the moment and just kind of reacting to things that are occurring right now. And so now he's flying, and he's starting to begin his transformation into something different. He meets a man named Reverend Cooper, and Reverend Cooper explains, like, he knows about the whole family, and he explains about making the first deaths, that the white people who employed them were the ones that were guilty of his death, who killed him. And so Milkman goes to Lincoln's Heaven, and there's not much there. It's a rotting house, and he sees this old woman coming down the stairs, almost transparent, he says, and it's Cirque. We're not really sure if Cirque is a ghost or if she's real, because they do talk to each other. Cirque tells Milkman that making dead the first real name was Jake, and Jake's wife was a woman named Singh, Jake and Singh. I think I have a link to the family tree in the link, so you can kind of follow this. So Macon Dead's first name was Jake. Jake's wife was Singh. And Cirque says Jake's body was washed into a cave, and it's been there ever since. And so Milkman wants to get to the cave, and he doesn't know how to get there. He tries to hitchhike. He finds a bus station, and then he's waiting for the bus. He looks out the window, and he sees a guy like trying to move this one big crate by himself onto this weighing platform. And so Milkman decides, I'm going to go help him, and he goes helps him. And so we'll come back to that point, but that incident is really important. It's really this moment that Milkman is doing something for someone else for the first time in the book, really. Everything to this point has always been about Milkman and his small little world, and now suddenly he's starting to do things for other people. Let's see. He's trying to find a way to get to the cave. He goes to, he buys a car, and he stops in this store called Solomon's General Store. And if you remember, Mr. Solomon was Pilate's first husband's name. The guy in the store is named Mr. Solomon. And he says, oh, you're Milkman. Somebody stopped by here and wanted to give you a message. And Milkman's like, what's the message? Your day is here. What's the message? And Milkman knew that probably was guitar. He leaves the store, Milkman does, and out in the street he hears kids singing a song about Jay. And Jay is the son of someone named Solomon. And this is when Milkman suddenly regrets his miserable childhood, and it's miserable only because of him, right? And so seeing those kids and what those kids are singing about, and singing these stories of the past and all that, he realizes that maybe he did take advantage of all of those things, and maybe he was too sad about his inability to fly. He goes back into the store, and he meets these men who invite him to go hunting. And they go hunting in a place called Rhina Gulch. They break up into pairs. By the way, all of these people he goes hunting with a lot of them have biblical names: Calvin, Luther, Solomon, Omar, King, Walker, Vernell, and Small Boy. I don't think Small Boy is a biblical name, but they break up into pairs. Milkman and Calvin are hunting together, and Milkman gets tired. They're out hunting in Rhina Gulch. And so he leans down next to a tree and rests, but Calvin keeps hunting. He thinks about how he's mistreated everyone. Milkman does, especially Hagar, who he loves. He realizes that he loves her, but has treated her poorly, and he suddenly begins to have these self-realizations about himself for the first time. And most people, or some people, have trouble doing this, right? And Milkman has never done this in his life, but now he's able to see himself for who he really is, and is satisfied that he can do it, but he's not happy with what he sees in the past. But then suddenly guitar shows up, and he starts choking. He puts a wire around Milkman's neck, and he starts choking, and he says, your day is here, or your day has come, or something like that. I forget. And again, Milkman just kind of relaxes. He's like, you know what? If I'm supposed to die, I'm just going to let it happen. And he thinks he breathes his last breath, and suddenly there's a rifle shot, which scares Guitar away. The hunters return, and they're laughing at Milkman because Milkman's the one who accidentally shot off his rifle, not at anything, but that's what scared Guitar off. At breakfast here, he learns that his grandmother, who is again his name Singh, married to Jake, was a Native American who is the daughter of someone named Susan Bird, and that one of Susan Bird's relatives, lives in the area as well. That night, Milkman spends the night with a prostitute named Sweet. And we're not sure if this is love or not, but we'll get to this in a minute. So the next day he goes and visits Susan Bird. And Susan claims that Singh was never married, which frustrates Milkman. But he walks out of that meeting, even though he doesn't have the answers that he wants to, realize that he wants to know the answers about his family, and that the family suddenly means a lot to him. And the past, the things that he's had trouble with, dealing with his whole life, suddenly mean something to him. He goes back to Sweet's place, who is the prostitute, and so maybe this is more than just a prostitute relationship. And Guitar is there and confronts him, and he accuses Milkman of stealing the gold and shipping it back home. And Milkman says, "I haven't found any gold. I haven't shipped anything." And Guitar's like, "Yes, you did. I saw you at the bus station shipping that crate." And he's like, "No, I was just helping that guy." And Guitar was like, "Absolutely not. You're not that type of person. You don't help people." Crushing. But we see the Milkman growing up, really. And he begins to see like the flaws of his parents and the flaws of Pilot, and realizing these are all human beings who have their own struggles and strengths and weaknesses and all that. And he begins to miss Hagar. He hears the song again about Solomon. Solomon flying across the sky. And realizes the song is about his grandfather, great-grandfather. So he decides to go back to Michigan, where he gets back home and he sees Hagar in his room, naked and despondent, like out of control. Remember, she's obsessed with him. So he drives her home, and she's still depressed. Pilot and Reba try to cheer her up, but she wakes from her catatonic state in a frantic move, and she's trying to figure out ways that what she can do to make herself look better so that Milkman will love her. Reba, if you remember, has won that diamond ring, but pawns it and gets $200 and gives it to Hagar to go buy clothes and makeup and all that. And so she does. Hagar does. She gets all dialed up and looks fantastic and is walking home, but is caught in a thunderstorm. She tries to hurry, but she can't. And by the time she gets home, she's a mess. Her makeup's running, her clothes are ruined, her hair is ruined. She's dirty and all that. She looks in the mirror and then collapses in exhaustion and dies. Reba goes to Macon Jr. and says, "Can you give us money to have a funeral for Hagar?" He reluctantly gives it over, and the funeral is glamorous, like anything you can imagine that could be at a funeral. There is there, but hardly no people show up, even though it's so luxurious and glamorous. Pilot leans over in the cemetery or into the coffin, and the last words she says to Hagar is, "And she was loved." Just a couple more slides. Milkman goes back to Susan Bird, if you remember, and tries to find out the answers to the story. And it turns out that Singh did go with Jake. And they might not have been married, but Singh and Jake were together, and they joined this Flying African Children's Tribe. Flying African Children's Tribe. And they were this tribe was headed by Solomon and Rina. They had 21 boys. They tried to take Jake with them, but they brushed a tree branch as they were flying, and Jake dropped into the yard of Susan Bird, or their great grandparents. And this is where Jake met Singh, and they had a son, and et cetera, et cetera. And so it is all true. There's some magical things there about the family. Milkman runs off to Sweet's place. Sweet offers him a bath. He's like, "No, why do I want to sit in a bath? I want the whole sea." And so they go swimming in a swimming hole. Milkman is singing the Song of Solomon at the top of his voice because he kind of like makes this connection that there's all these people and this magic and supernatural things and meaning to his life of how he got to be who he is and where he is. So he goes to Michigan, goes back to Michigan. But if you remember, Hagar has died and he doesn't know this. And so he goes to Pilate to tell her what he's learned. And Pilate says, don't you know Hagar's dead? And Pilate locks Milkman in their basement and says, you shall, if you take a life, you own it. And so keeps him in the cellar. In the cellar also is the green sack of bones that was in that green sack. And Milkman tells Pilate that these are the bones of Macon the First, or Jake, this member of the flying tribe. So this concept again of flying, that Milkman has a history of, family history of being able to fly and all this stuff. And this excites Pilate as well, and they decide that they need to go bury the bones of Macon the First, or Jake, back in the family land, back in a place called Rhina Gulch, which is, if you remember, where we were. So they go back there and they bury the bodies, and they feel very strong and very happy. And suddenly they hear, Milkman stands up and he sees a shadowy figure out in the distance. And he hears a gunshot, and the gunshot hits Pilate, and Pilate falls to the ground and dies. And then Milkman and Guitar lock eyes, and they know what's about to happen. And instead of running away, Milkman jumps into the air. And the last words of the book are, if you surrender to the air, you can ride it. And it kind of leaves it up to you what happens next. Does Milkman get shot and killed by Guitar? Does he fly like his family history has told him he could? It's up to you, whatever you want to think. So some things to think about really is all about family. And what the past might tell us about today. Are you the person you are because of simply who you are, or are you the person you are because of other things? And I want you to think if this is a happy story or a hopeful story or a depressing story. But it's certainly an exciting story. So I really look forward to your analysis of this book. And if you have any questions, let me know. But other than that, I will see you next time. Thanks.